So why am I here? I'm here because of Jane Goodall. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I have been for a very long time. And when I was 12 years old, I was home with the flu, and I was sick in bed. And my mother went out, and she came home, and she brought me Jane Goodall's first book, In the Shadow of Man. And I remember lying in bed and reading that book, and then the next day when I was feeling better, pretending to still be sick so I could stay home and finish reading Jane Goodall's book about studying among chimpanzees. And from that moment forward, I knew I wanted to be an anthropologist. So I went off to college with an anthropology major as a freshman, which is unheard of. No one ever does that. And then I took an archaeology class, and I thought, oh, okay, I want to be an archaeologist, not a primate specialist. And then I took animal behavior and primate behavior, and I thought, no, I don't want to do archaeology, I want to be a primatologist. And then I took some cultural anthropology classes, and I'm like, nope, primatology is definitely out, it's cultural anthropology. And that's what I ended up staying with. So when people meet me and they hear I'm an anthropologist, they almost always say, oh, so you dig up bones. And I reply that I like my people alive and juicy and able to talk back to me. So over the course of my career, I've done research in a lot of different places with lots of different kinds of people. And then a number of years ago, I reached a point where I decided I wasn't going to be able to go back to Africa anymore. It was just too difficult for me. I had worked for 30 years with humanitarian organizations doing economic development work. And I decided I needed to do something different. And I read this wonderful book called Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. And she had really approached her research the way an anthropologist does, and that is, she had a population of really fascinating people, women, all African American, who had been instrumental in NASA and the space program, mathematicians that made the rockets fly and made them come back to Earth safely. And I realized what she had done is talk about this very unknown population of women who were really fascinating and really did important work, and no one had ever heard of them. So she wrote the book Hidden Figures. And I met Margot shortly after I had read the book. And it was really, honestly, it was like a eureka moment for me. I thought about what are the other populations that are fascinating groups of people that most folks don't know anything about. And I immediately thought about Westbeth. I had been coming to Westbeth as a visitor for many, many, many years. Two of my father's sisters and his youngest brother lived here in the building. All of them were artists and long-term residents from the very first years in Westbeth. And so I came here, and with the help of the wonderful George Kominski, he started helping me make connections with people. And when I would ask them if I could interview them, they almost always weren't quite sure why I wanted to interview them, but almost everyone agreed. And when I would say, if you could give me an hour of your time. And then I found the secret of doing cultural anthropology to be very, very true, and that is people like to talk about themselves. So when you get people in a room and you can have a quiet conversation, my 1 hour interviews went on for 2 and 3 and 4 interviews, 4 hours. And I remember one day I foolishly scheduled 3 interviews back to back on one day. By the end of the day, I could barely stand up. I was so tired from concentrating and taking notes. And then it took me like a week to type up my notes just from that day's worth of interviews. But over the course of the last few years, I have met some of the most interesting people I've ever encountered in my career. And writing this book about Westbeth has really been the true labor of love in my whole career. Almost all of my writing has been more or less on the scientific side, even though I was dealing with very human issues. But this one is just a joyful thing for me to work on and to write about the life experiences of the people who have lived here from the very beginning, those who moved in later years, those who grew up here, some of whom still live here, many of whom do not. And so that was how this book came into being. when I think about this, and I put this in the context that I lived in an extremely remote village in the Philippines with no water and no electricity, no transportation. And then I spent 30 years off and on living in Africa, in rural areas in Africa, and 5 years in Kenya, and then shorter periods of time in Ethiopia and Zambia and Zimbabwe, and then going back and forth to rural Mozambique for about 10 years. Many people would say, oh, you've lived in such exotic places, and I suppose in many ways that's true. But really, honestly, being here at Westbeth was perhaps the most exotic place that I have ever done research. And it's been such a joy to meet these interesting people and to capture a little bit of their stories. When I was working on the book, there were a couple people who live here who were really good sounding boards for me. One of whom was George. And I said to him, I have to keep telling people this is not a book about a person at Westbeth or a few people at Westbeth. It's about the community of Westbeth. And I wasn't sure how that was going to be received, because there are a lot of people here who should, by all rights, be really famous because they've done really amazing things. But I couldn't write about one person. There are a few books that have been written about one or more people in the building, including my Uncle Joe. There are a couple of books about him. But this was really about this community of artists. And so when I was talking to George, when the book had been accepted, and I was excited but also trepidatious, I said to him, how do you think people are going to receive the book? And he said, well, it's hard to say. And I said, I have a feeling they're going to say, well, the book was okay, but not enough about me. And they're right. I mean, there's not enough about any one individual in this community of amazing people. But that wasn't my goal. My goal was really to capture the ethos of a community of artists, because it's a very special place. So I hope maybe I've done that, and maybe done it a little bit of justice. And I hope I get the word out to other people who will find Westbeth a little mecca to come visit while they make their voyages to New York City. It's really, as I say, it's really been the most fun thing I've ever worked on. One of the more hilarious stories is from a photographer named Bob Gruen, who was very good friends with John Lennon. And he took many important photos of Lennon and everybody else in the world of rock and roll. The famous picture of Lennon that was published after his death and that later was on a stamp, where he has a t-shirt with the sleeves cut off and he's, looking very tough in the camera with sunglasses on. That was a Bob Gruen picture. And Bob had moved from one apartment to another here in the building. And anyone who's been in Westbeth knows it's a rabbit warren, and you can easily get lost and you can't find your way from one side of the building to the other. And so Lennon was coming to visit Bob, I think it was a Sunday morning, and he was coming to the building, and Bob said, well, call me from the front desk and I will come get you, because I know you can't find your way around the building. But John Lennon decided to ignore that advice, and instead he set off, and he was walking down hallways and knocking on doors. Do you know where Bob Gruen lives? Nope. But, oh, it's John Lennon. Let me show you my latest painting. Somebody else knocking on the door. Oh my goodness, it's John Lennon. Let me read you my poem. And this went on and on and on as every door he knocked on. And finally he found his way to Bob Gruen's apartment. And the very first thing he said when he walked in was, man, you have weird neighbors. And I've always thought that was just very true, but also very, very charming. And let me think, what are some of the other wonderful stories that I've heard over the years about people here? One of the people I was closest here was my Aunt Shami. And she lived here from the time she moved in at the same time as the very first residents in early 1970. And she stayed here until her death in March 2020, just as the COVID epidemic was appearing, although she didn't die of COVID. And she was in a very bad vehicle accident about 10 years before she died. None of us thought she would survive. And so for the last years of her life, she was cared for by a series of caregivers who had to be with her because she really was physically unable to like get up out of a chair and go to the bathroom by herself and so on. And one of her longest term caregivers was a woman named Emmy who didn't have papers. And one day, Shami said to her, "Emmy, I have a plan, so you don't have to worry anymore. I think we should get married, and then I can sponsor you for American citizenship." And Emmy said, "Well, I don't know. Let me think about it." And the next day she came in, and she came to work, and she looked very seriously at Shami, and she said, "Shami, I don't think I can marry you." And Shami said, "You're breaking up with me?" Which was, if you knew my Aunt Shami, was so characteristic of her. But Emmy stayed with her for the rest of her life, and my family owes a huge debt of gratitude to this woman who, through ice storms and COVID and thick and thin, stood by Shami at her most frail moments. And really that's a lesson about Westbeth, because people here take care of each other. This is a community where when people get old and they become frail, they don't just go into their apartments and disappear and someone finds them dead days later, although that has happened a few times. This is a place where when people need help, they get it from their neighbors. One of the second generation I interviewed, Josh Hamilton, was talking about his mother, Sandra Kingsbury. And Sandra's a wonderful person. And he said, "You know, it's really like a village. My mother's always talking about how somebody had a fall and she was going over and helping them get dressed or get bathed, or somebody else was not feeling well and she cooked food and brought them food." And that's really part of the reason why I decided to do this entire research project, because it was very clear to me that Westbeth is just like the villages that I studied in Africa. It's just like every village where, for better or worse, everybody knows each other's business. Well, to quote Nadia Dajani, everybody's up in each other's cornflakes. But that's both the best thing, maybe the worst thing about being in a village, that you're part of this community of people who look after each other. And that's been a really important lesson for me to learn about why Westbeth works so well and why it's a place that should be emulated by other communities. I hope maybe you're interested in my book now. My book about this community of artists is called Creative Ozone, The Artists of Westbeth, published as part of the Empire State Books from Fordham University Press. And the title comes from a quote from Christina Maley. The interview I did with her, and then many other people said similar things, that this building, which had been the Bell Telephone Research Labs, which had been the site of huge innovations in science, that this building is kind of imbued with a creative energy. And first it was the energy that focused the scientists who worked here, and then beginning in 1970, it focused the artists who lived here. So the creative ozone seeps into the people who live here and makes them do things that are really wonderful. And that's my book, and I hope you'll enjoy it.